Hey everyone, welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. The noise you might hear behind me is the incessant sound of police helicopters, the usual audio background to life in Los Angeles. Yes, folks, this is the Slow Dystopia, and as always, I start out every episode sinking into a pit of despair, and then crawling out immediately as I announce the guest, because, as always, this is a very interesting episode with David Thomas of Pere. And if you don't know much about David, why don't I tell you his bio right now. Raised in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, David Thomas is one of the founders of the short-lived but influential punk band Rocket from the Tombs, who split up after about a year, with some members going off to form the Dead Boys, while David founded Pere. While David would record on and off with the self-described avant-garage Pere over the next 40 years, he has also recorded with a number of different collaborators under a number of different names, such as David Thomas and the Pedestrians, David Thomas and the Wooden Birds, and David Thomas and Two Pale Boys. Earlier in September, Fire Records reissued two classic Pere albums, Pennsylvania and St. Arkansas. We talk a lot about Pennsylvania in this episode. This is really great. I've been a fan of Pere since, college, I think. I remember my friend John introduced me to a lot of art rock around the same time. Henry Cow and Art Bears, Universe Zero. What else? Robert Wyatt? Soft Machine, Pere and I've been listening to all of those, but Pere ever since. So this was delightful. I didn't really know much about David himself, and it's interesting. He's kind of curmudgeonly, but also extremely open. And even though partway through he's like, I don't want to talk about too much personal stuff, we do get into some really personal stuff that I think does illuminate the music he writes. So I hope you enjoy this episode. If you do, what I like to do here in the beginning is a little recommended if you like. If you like this talk with David Thomas, you might like these other episodes where I talk to people of a similar bend. Weasel Walter, Arto Lindsay, David Harrington of Kronos Quartet, Bobby Previtt, that was wonderful, one of my favorites, Terry Riley, Melvin Gibbs, and so on and so forth. I've done hundreds of interviews with musicians and TV writers and actors and comedians and artists. So if you like what you hear, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. Got some great episodes coming up, including Buzz Osborne from the Melvins, Julie Doiron, and I think next week or the week after, sometime soon, Keith, wonderful cartoonist Keith Knight, and also the creator of the television show Woke. So look out for those. But for now, let's talk to David.
I'm so fed up with conspiracy idiots. If it's a conspiracy, how come you know about it? It's such an obvious point, but, they don't get it because they're smarter than everybody else and they know about it, whereas the entirety of history doesn't know about it, Anyway, whatever. What the hell? There's nothing to be done about it.
Well, I'm actually kind of curious because you were, let's say, a teenager, well, into your 20s maybe, when this turn in culture started happening, right? I would say probably like the early 70s is when really, like, I guess conspiracy theories started.
Well, well, maybe. I mean, you might be technically right, but there was no, it's not like it was now. It is now. I mean, there were still, sensible people, and the people who believed in the conspiracies weren't necessarily in and of themselves idiots, who were unconscious of anything else, But yeah, I guess you're right. But it really didn't kick in at the hideous level it is now until probably 10, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe. I don't know. It's
right. Well, it's metastasized now. I,
yeah.
I was just more curious about like, have you seen like, you know, in Ohio, I'm from Pennsylvania, so I'm fascinated with artists from the Rust Belt, just from a narcissistic perspective.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if like maybe you saw the seeds of this in Ohio at all around you when you were growing
Well,
up.
Ohio, and where in Pennsylvania are you from?
Reading, Pennsylvania?
All right. Well, Ohio and probably Reading aren't like New York or LA or anything on the East Coast or anything on the West Coast. It's an entirely different culture that foreigners, frankly, have a hard time understanding. And it was, you talk to foreigners and they want to go visit America and they're going to go to New York, and I tell them New York is it's not like the rest of the country. There's thousands of miles of America that are not like New York, or Reading, Pennsylvania, So, my and the people out there, are not stupid. They're sophisticated. They have a far stronger sense of community, and intricacies and on and on and on than necessary than I don't know, far more deep than New York, for instance, but it's certainly as deep, and I enjoy the Midwest, and I enjoy the interior of America and small towns. I'm semi-Pennsylvanian myself at this point, really, because my parents moved, being literature art people, did what all the literature and art people wanted to do in the early 70s, which is buy a farm, and move out of the city into the country, and they certainly that's what professors and teachers want, that was a big ambition, is to buy a farm, So
yeah, that's interesting. My mentor in grad school, was very much into woodworking and gardening and had, not a farm, but a huge garden where he had different, he did grow different vegetables and different.
Yeah.
areas.
Well, in other words, move out into the country,
Yeah.
No, my parents' farm is really not much of a farm. It's 50 acres. 50 acres is nothing, but it's up on a hill out in the wilderness, because Pennsylvania, again, many people don't understand. There's nothing in Pennsylvania. Right. Pennsylvania is a wilderness. I mean, literally a wilderness from one end of the state to the other. And you've got Philadelphia and you've got Pittsburgh, and that's it.
Yeah.
And I-80 goes nowhere near either of those. Pennsylvania is basically the I-80 state, Interstate 80 state. And you go on that, that's, I called the album Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania is the space between where you are and where you want to be, and for us, it was, it was New York. We had to go to get to New York and the East Coast, the entirety of the East Coast. You had to go through Pennsylvania. And to go through Pennsylvania, you go on I-80. And there is nothing on I-80. It manages somehow in all of America to be the one interstate that avoids any population centers at all, and so that's, I had a motto for Pennsylvania, that Pennsylvania, the I-80 state, there's too much of it, and so, but my parents and my brother, live out near Meadville, in Meadville or south of Meadville in the western PA, and I quite enjoy it. My brother never locks his house. He's a, he builds and troubleshoots vast chemical works out in the Far East and China and Malaysia and Indonesia and all these places. And he went to MIT, and he's a real brainiac, and he was a chess master at 13. And then he switched to card counting at Vegas, because he said,
What?
well, look, I'm a chess master and I get these little plastic trophies. I use the same skills, and I go out to Las Vegas and I come back with sacks of money. Now, the money doesn't mean anything to him. He would leave the money in paper bags around his house, thousands of dollars in paper bags that were like trophies for him. It wasn't money. He didn't care about the damn money. They were trophies, like the little plastic thing, and he never would lock his house, and he would never get broken into. And nobody on the street locks their house. It's an entirely different world, even now, even today, where he finally put a lock on his door that he just tells everybody what the code is, just so they can come in, and, it's not New York. It's not LA. It's a different world still.
See, I wonder if there's two, because there's my perspective of Pennsylvania is 76, because that goes through the bottom part of the state. And that's because I went to Pitt for undergrad, and that's mostly what I would take, 76. And that itself is like, it's still that kind of rural feeling that you're talking about, but there's every like 40 miles there's a city or something. There's like a small, maybe not a city, but maybe like a town.
I really hate 876 because I think it was one of the first interstates built, and it's just a nightmare to drive. It's got
100%.
They have these hairpin turns it's always under construction. You're always going through a damn tunnel where you get trapped in the tunnel, and I hate 76. I'm I-80 all the way.
So I think rounding back to where I started, I'm very curious about you growing up in Ohio. I mean, I read that you were born in Miami. At what age did your family move to Ohio?
Well, I don't know, when I was 6 or 7, I can't remember.
So you were mostly formed by Ohio. Like Miami maybe got a little bit of itself in you.
Well, I have my mother's family came over just after the Mayflower, and so she's got a very, traditional Georgia upbringing where all of the women are mathematicians and teachers of mathematics, which is the traditional way of things in the South, among a certain class, I'll say, of Southerners, and so I feel a great affinity to the South. But my father was first generation American from Wales with a French parent, and so I consider myself an Ohioan. I don't really consider that I have much of a connection to Miami, but I do feel a very significant Southern connection.
Interesting. Well, then, I mean, you live in the UK now. Did you feel the pull of the UK because of your father?
No. At that time, I was married to an English woman, and she was an only child, and her father died, and she felt that she had to be close to her mother. So we moved over here. I like England. I've always liked England. But there was no particular pull. It's just another place to live. I don't care.
No, I only asked it because my parents are from New York, and I had always felt this pull of New York. until I finally, and when I finally moved there, it felt right. Like that was when I finally started to settle as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm kind of curious about these, I don't even know what to call them. These geographic beckoning, this feeling of geographic beckoning that sometimes you get from your parents or sometimes you get from your ancestors, or like you feel, like you said, this is a little different, but you said you feel an affinity for the South from your mom.
Yeah.
Even though you,
well, we spent a lot of time down there, but yeah, years ago I started to try to explain to people that Cleveland was a place that had become a ghost town. And once and if you live in a ghost town, then it frankly doesn't matter, whether my body is in Cleveland, Ohio, or my body is in London or Hove, England. I live in a ghost town. The ghost town goes with me wherever I go. Now, I like to go back to America, and I know that I'm a Midwesterner, and I know that I'm a Clevelander more particularly, but the Cleveland I exist in, that I'm from, doesn't exist anymore. It's a ghost town. Everything is, this happens to all. That's just part of growing up. This is part of getting old. This is a part of urban renewal. Everything that I knew and grew up with has been torn, not everything, but but it's been torn down, and replaced. But I still see the original. I still, for me, the Nike missile base, along the lakefront still is there. We have to get protected from those Canadians. We had a Nike missile base, and on and on and on. So all those places still exist. And as I'm driving along the lake, the shoreway, I pass by what was the Nike missile base, and I remember it. I can see the ornamentation and the signs and all of that sort of stuff they used to have there. It's just the nature of things.
Yeah, I used to be obsessed with the word palimpsest. Like where something gets erased, but and written over, but you can kind of see what was erased underneath.
Yeah.
And there is that kind of like feeling in that, like you can kind of see both in your mind's eye, and there are just like little bits of leftovers that you can still see in the geography.
Yes, of course. Well, as I've said endless times as well, that the land is a mirror. The geography is a mirror. And reflected in it, we see ourselves. And the nature of geography, it's not just the mountain or whatever, or the river. It's what we add to the mountain or the river. The little shack or the skyscraper or whatever. All of that is geography. And all of that is a mirror that we see ourselves reflected. And now you can choose to look in the mirror and see yourself, or you can choose to look away. Most people choose to look away, or many people choose to look away. But it doesn't change the nature of things. And geography doesn't lie. You've got politicians galore who will lie at you, and everybody on the TV will lie at you. But the land will not lie. It shows you what you are, what you've done to it, what for good and for bad. There's all, it's all part of the nonsense of. I mean, people talk about, what man does to the, New York City is the skyscrapers in New York are as natural, quote unquote, natural as any redwood tree or any cow or any bush, on a farm. They're as natural as that. It's part of our world. It's like saying the dam that a beaver builds is not a natural item, or an anthill, or a cat's a wolf's lair, or any of that stuff. So it's all tied in.
Yeah. I used to teach this environmental philosophy class where that was one of the main themes was, humans tend to put this dividing line down between us and other animals, but there is no real dividing line. That's an artificial creation.
Well, there is a dividing line in that man is not just another animal. This idea that, you get all these cat people who would say, I would rather see a person die than my cat die. Well, fuck you. A person is not a cat. A person, human beings are the crown of creation. We have consciousness, we have guilt, we have love. Dogs have love. Okay. But, you get what I mean. I mean, this is one of the most irritating things I run across, but it just isn't one of a long list of irritating things I run across.
Sure. I was just talking about in terms of like conceptualizing of what nature is, capital N nature. We tend to put ourselves into this into the separate category that is apart. And then we put the things we create in the separate category when humans are natural, and therefore the things exactly like you said, the things we make are just extensions of that in some way.
Yes, of course. Of course. Well, it's clearly obvious to me. It's clearly obvious to you. I fail to see why it's not obvious to other people, but other people have agendas, and other people have, their own wretched lives, the screw up they've made of their own life, and they have to blame somebody else for how they've screwed their life up, Well, and I've got no problem with people screwing their life. Everybody makes mistakes all the time. Everybody makes mistakes. I make a dozen mistakes a day, but I deal with it. I say, well, you fucked that up. Well, try not to do it next time, and you get on with things. That's just the way life is.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is a general human phenomenon or if it's just very American, but because we have such a bureaucratic society, I think that there is this feeling of anytime I take responsibility, anytime I'm like, well, I just made a mistake, the repercussions are going to be so huge. Like when I used to work at a supermarket, I remember any day job I ever had, I remember the feeling like if I made a mistake, even like the most minor mistake, I started to get hot and sweat and be like, I'm going to get fired for this. And I got to figure out some way of deflecting the responsibility. And I think that feeling has permeated all of society because everything is so, especially like your healthcare and all this kind of stuff is so dependent upon your employment because we have such this unforgiving neoliberal bureaucratic society that you tend to it's very difficult. And the people who do take responsibility for themselves, who are step up in some kind of out of the feeling of responsibility, feeling of morality, what have you. Once they do that, they then take on, they do get fired or something like that. And it's out of proportion for what happened, for whatever mistake they made. And they become this kind of warning, well, don't do that. Don't take responsibility. Figure out a way to deflect it as much as possible.
Yeah. Well, it's all about deflection. Nobody, everybody fears the word judgment. Well, this was clear to us when we devised the principles of data panic back in the early 70s, mid 70s, is that the worst thing, judgment is anathema to data panic. It interferes with data flow. Judgment is the worst possible thing. Well, what separates us from monkeys other than judgment? Other than sitting there going, well, that was wrong. You shouldn't have done that. I'm not going to beat you up about it, but you screwed up. Just like I screw up, just like everybody screws up, you did it. so deal with it. Don't let it happen again, or try not to let it happen again. Do something about it. But whatever.
Well, what was the moral framework that you grew up with?
The moral framework?
Yeah, like was it religious? Were your parents just like, hey, here's a list of things that you don't do, or you do?
Well, no, my mother always tried to get me to. Well, my mother was always it's usual, as often is the case, the spiritual explorer of the family. The father kind of trails along. Not you know what I mean. I'm just shorthanding everything.
Sure.
So I remember she would, visit one church and like, we would go down, she would take me to the Methodist church, but, after a few, a little while, she would become disillusioned by whatever. Okay. And then a Presbyterian church. So I don't know. She was Christian, and I grew up in that framework, though it was a framework of searching for things, knowing, for instance, she was convinced that the Christian framework was the proper framework, but she kept on having problems with the organized religions that sprouted up within that framework, So that's I don't want to go too deeply into it all because it's personal, and I don't want to I try to avoid too much that's personal in these sort of discussions and interviews. But I mean, that's the general framework. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, whatever you're comfortable with. Because I'm just curious about, if you said they came over after the Mayflower, are they, so is it like a long line of Protestants?
Yeah. Basically everybody who came over in the 1600s was a religious refugee, basically, up until, sometime in the 18th century. I'm sure it began to shift a bit. But the people who came over that early, were refugees more often than not.
Yeah. And by the way, if I like ask anything that's too personal, I mean, obviously.
Yeah, don't worry. I'll let you know.
I just don't want to tread too far into where you're uncomfortable talking about. But
yeah, well, I do keep a real separation between my personal life and my artistic life, and the only reason you're talking to me is for my artistic life. I don't mind talking to you like you're a human being, but there's a certain point at which I don't want it showing up in print.
Sure. Well, here's a question.
Mainly because there's a lot of jerks out there who will use it for jerk purposes.
Totally. Well, then here's a question. How do you see your personal life and your artistic life connected? Because like one of the theories that I have on this show is that, especially your childhood is this fundament in which your artistic life comes out of. And when you kind of like settle into who you are, your childhood comes back into the things you make in some way. Like it's very, I mean, without getting too high-minded about it, it's a kind of Hegelian understanding of human beings.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I particularly had a normal childhood. My childhood was very early on a pursuit. My father was an American literature professor and a teacher, and the house was full of books. And he didn't say, "Oh, read this, read that." There was just books. And so I would, I'd be 8 years old and I'd take down a John Dos Passos book, or a William Faulkner book or something like that. Now, I couldn't understand William Faulkner. It drove me nuts trying to follow it, but I admired the writing style. I mean, I thought to myself, God, I wish I could write like this, and I had I was struggling to get through a paragraph of it. But, and he had, he wasn't a big music person, but he had a red vinyl Lenny Bruce album, and he didn't say, oh, listen to this, or, oh, don't listen to this, or anything. It was just a red Lenny Bruce album. So I put Lenny Bruce on, 9 years old, and I thought, oh, this guy's funny, and I was reading Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, when I was 11, and on and on and on, so I'm not sure that I had a particularly standard childhood, but and I know, for instance, that when I was in third grade, maybe fourth grade, I discovered the secret of anti-gravity, that I was able to go out into the backyard and glide above the surface of the ground. And I thought to myself, this is so simple. This is too simple to do. I'm going to forget it. I'm going to forget how to do this. And sure enough, within 2 or 3 days, I had forgotten how to do it. But I do remember very clearly, and it's not some childhood fantasy, I remembered very clearly that I had somehow was able to do that. It was sort of like a skateboard technique that I had developed, where I'd kind of push myself along with one foot and glide on the other foot above the surface, only a couple inches, maybe 3 or 4 inches. But, I know that it was possible, and someday maybe I'll remember how simple it was. But that was the key thing that I got from the whole experience, was that it's so simple to do this that I'm going to forget it. I'm going to forget how to do it, and that has the ring of truth to me. I was always very conscious of the ring of truth, and, because truth has a certain simplicity to it. Complexity is full of lies and deception. All solutions are simple. It's whether you have the courage to be that simple, to take a stick to it, no matter what comes. Because I always knew also that the ring of truth would be also that you don't really want to go there. It hurts to go. It hurts to go there.
Yep.
But you have to do it. That's it's really simple. So, I was fairly committed from childhood to what I eventually became, I suppose, is some voice in the wilderness, because, not that I've always been a great example of it or whatever, but I knew that from my parents, I got the notion of searching, you're always searching. My father, I remember endlessly, my father we would just be sitting there and he would erupt in some Walt Whitman, exposition where he would just, rattle off a Walt Whitman's poem or a Vachel Lindsay piece or whatever. And everybody in the family would be going, oh, please, not again, but he had this line, which was, if a joke's funny once, it's funny 1,000 times, and he would just rattle this stuff off, and my mother was always searching for, in her own, she was an artist on her own right. And through her art and through her reading and on and on. And they never tried to make me read anything. It was just there, so it was part of my childhood. You just read this stuff, and eventually you'll understand it.
Yeah. Yeah. See, I had this kind of empathetic feeling with you, because I was last night I was trying to imagine your childhood, because I'm a big Alfred Jarry fan, and It's because like when I was a kid, my parents had like the Ubu Roy plays. Like they had a book of them sitting on the shelf. Like we had a little library in our house, and I would just go with the same thing. William Faulkner, Kurt Vonnegut, whatever. I would just pull down stuff. Jean-Paul Sartre. I didn't understand half of it when I was a kid. Most of it, especially Sartre. Like I didn't get that. I didn't understand that until college. But like, I would sit there and try to read it. And that really like that kind of like, I don't know, it created this kind of, I was going to say spell. That's a bad word. Atmosphere. How about that? It just created this kind of atmosphere of like anything, like you could just like kind of discover stuff on your own.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that was a good upbringing. I don't know how I would have reacted, I mean, my mother used to take me down to the Art Museum in Cleveland, and she'd take me to the Renaissance paintings and explain, the dynamics of light and of perspective and all this stuff. And I would just go, oh, please, all right, okay, yeah. I mean, I was a typical stroppy teenager, embarrassed by her, talking about, she would just sit there and tell me, a lecture, not a lecture, but basically a lecture on the dynamics of light and the evolution of light in painting. And at the time I would just be like, oh, right, can we go now? But I remember it all, and she didn't force it. She just she was excited by it, and she talked about it, in those terms.
Because like the thing that I'm thinking about is like, okay, your standard like intellectual atmosphere that you hear people grow up in, when people talk about having like this intellectual background, it's often talked about in a cold way. But it seems like the one that you grew up in was warm, right? That there was empathy, that you had your antenna up. Like you said earlier about like talking about truth, like it was a gut feeling for you, right?
Yeah, right.
Right. And I think having that kind of awareness when you're young, because I buried mine. And this is, I like to talk to people from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rust Belt, and it could just be that, I'm younger than you and things changed. Like things changed through the 70s. And so like when I started to grow up in the 80s, it was a different, like the world
was vastly different.
Yeah.
Vastly different. Everything changed very drastically in the 70s. Very, very, very drastically. Not necessarily for the better.
Well, what was your experience of that then? And then I'll get back to the kind of like...
What do you mean, Mike? I don't understand the question.
Well, if you are aware of this change, like for me, I saw culture change, but it was more like 2008. And I was very aware of culture changing around 2008 through the financial crisis.
Yeah.
All right. And and especially like during the Trump years, I saw things change, and you could feel it, right? It was definitely like this bodily feeling. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of curious, you saying that you saw things change in the 70s, like what does that mean for you? Or what did you witness?
Well, I always considered my upbringing to be traditional American, this idea of, pursuing profit and commercial success was utterly alien, to me. That's not what an American does. An American pursues truth, or American pursues, I don't know what you would call it. But, in my family, I'm the oldest of three. Now, being the oldest has a certain amount of it's built-in crap to it. But, I was the pride and joy. I was the pride of my parents because I was an artist. I became an artist. I trained as a scientist, but I dropped it all and pursued art. Now, my brother was a millionaire by the time he was 25. My sister is a very highly achieved geologist specializing in water table research. My brother, as I told you, is a troubleshooter, paid at great expense by China and Indonesia to come out there and sort out their chemical plants, but, and of course they were proud of them, but I was the artist. I was the one, have never made a great deal of money. But that was irrelevant, because that's what, that's the culture of America. That was the culture of America. There was none of this. I'm trying to think of the cliche phrase they use, about, I don't know. It slipped my mind, but, the notion of commercial and financial success was alien to the culture I grew up in the 60s, in the early 70s. But at that point, it began to change, and so that, America became to represent, oh, well, you should, I'm trying to think of the damn cliche, you hear it in every movie and everything about, well, I don't know, that it concentrates on materialism and on the achievement of wealth and material goods, and Disney Channel and all the teenagers being obsessed by clothes and status symbols and all that crap, utterly unknown in the early 70s, and certainly in the 60s and the early 70s, and that all began to change, and that was the most significant change, where you forget your culture and forget your past and your heritage, and begin to fill your life full of materialism and crap.
How did you change through this, or did you change?
I don't know. I didn't change. I was, I don't know. I mean, what do you mean? How did I change? I'm not aware that I have changed. Like we say in Peru, the world changes. Peru doesn't change. We have the same idea. The ideas behind Peru are exactly now as they were when I created the band back in 75. Nothing has changed. Everybody says, oh, the albums are always different. No, they're not. They're all Peru, and we don't change. I don't, the notion of changing, if you're a revolutionary, then everything is changed, then your life has changed. Now I'm not going to go so far as to say I'm a revolutionary, but, it's like my brother and like we got a bad attitude. I got a bad attitude, and my attitude, to anybody who wants to tell me what to do, whether it's a government or anybody else, is fuck you, So now there's a downside to that. It's not all peaches and cream, but in the early 70s, there was an art, what we kind of called at the time an art terrorist group in Cleveland called Fred and Ethel Mertz. And what they would do is, those television local news crew billboards, they're all smiley and healthy and, Action 5 news team, with all that kind of crap. We lie because we care, and what they would do is they would go, they would go and paint on Goulardi glasses and Goulardi goatees on all of these, and spray paint these huge. They had basically two slogans that they would spray paint over these billboards and massive productions: question authority and nuke the whales. And so this is, they had a bad attitude, and I had a bad attitude because I would see those billboards, and I go, yeah, I understand. I know what it means, So, there's a downside to having a bad attitude, but what can I do about it?
Well, I mean, I guess this is the thing that I'm curious about. You see culture change, and your response is to be more adamant about who you are.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas other people would have been like, oh, well, I'm going to cash in, or I'm going to go with the flow, or maybe they weren't even aware that culture was changing, right? I think having that kind of empathy, to get back to this kind of like idea of empathy, I think having that feeling, that kind of gut feeling about the truth about the world is a particular thing. And I was about to say like artists have. It's not true. Some artists are just like psychos, right?
Yeah.
It's not anything particular.
Well, no, I have a very bad attitude towards artists. That's why I really don't like describing myself as an artist. I'm a musician. There's a pyramid. We are at the top of the pyramid. Way down below, scrabbling around like little ants, are painters and sculptors, and So I don't like talking about art. Talking about art to me is like, there was this fellow back in the 70s in Cleveland who, he was always going on about arty sort of crap and talking arty sort of crap. And he, and I remember very clearly, and it was a very distinctive landmark event in my life, when he said to me one time, yeah, I got these sunglasses to wear when I wear off the plane when I go to New York City, and it's like, what? That's, that to me is what art is you buy the sunglasses to wear in New York, when you get off the plane. Well, I reveled in the fact that we were Midwesterners and we didn't know anything about art. And, now this is the guy that had been reading John Dos Passos when he's 8 years old, but to me that was, I'm a musician. You pay me and I'll play,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to entertain you, because Pere was always in a band to entertain people. That's what we did, but we were going to entertain on our terms.
Sure.
And our terms were that we were going to deliver the goods. We're the kind of men who deliver the goods. And it may hurt to listen to us, or it may be unpleasant or disturbing, but we're going to deliver the goods. We're going to go out and entertain you, but we're doing it on our terms, on my terms, and that's always been the way it is. Pere delivers the goods on my damn terms. And I've done it for 40 years, and I'll do it till the day I die, but that's the deal. I don't know. So you want me to talk, people want me to talk about these things in some sort of highfalutin artistic sort of nonsense. And I don't do that. I'm a musician. You pay me, I'll play, that's as simple as it is.
I mean, here's the thing. One, I was using artist more as a just general term for anyone who makes something.
I understand that.
Right?
Yeah.
But I do think there is something. So I'm not talking about like the kind of like aesthetic trappings of someone who is, who's like wears the fashion of the thing that they like, has the uniform of an artist, right? I'm talking about someone who makes something. Like, for me, what's interesting is that you had this kind of defiant attitude. I'm going to do the thing I want to do. Right. And I'm curious about where that feeling came from. Has it always been, were you
I've always felt that way.
Like that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's not something that, there have been major events in my life that were not me. Well, there have been events where things focus even more clearly. One of the biggest focal points, events for me was, as you know, probably know, I used to love road trips, and I would just take off. And so years ago, my wife at the time and I went, did a road trip out to Nashville, Memphis, and down Highway 61, down US 49, over to Highway 61, and on and on and on. And she wanted to see. We were passing through Memphis, and she wanted to see Graceland. I didn't want to bother with it, and I wanted to catch up on Star Trek: The Next Generation episode that I had missed. That was on the TV that night. So I said, "You go over, take the car, go over, and I'll just hang around in the motel room." And this was a motel, the closest motel to Graceland. It was the Days Inn at the time, Brooks Road. And it turns out that that we were there on Elvis Death Week, commemoration Death Week, and the whole motel had been taken over by a phalanx of Elvis fans, and they had all of the rooms. They had opened the doors to all rooms, and on the beds was spread out they spread out their assembly of Elvis items, and things they had, and they were vastly wonderful people, very welcoming, very inviting, and they would give me things, and I would just sort of sit out by the pool. They were all congregated out by the pool and in and out of the rooms, and you would just sit there and talk, and one of the most striking events of my life was the realization I had that Elvis fans are nicer people than the people who laugh at Elvis fans. And again, it seems like a simple thing to say, but the corollaries of that thought were vast, and that emphasized even more my hatred, my disdain for the media priests who were running the culture into the ground, and from that point on, I had known this already. I was a Goulardi child. I knew more about the media when I was 8 years old than most people will ever learn, but that really focused my emotional response, my gut visceral response to the media and to the way that they crushed the society that I had grown up in, that I loved.
I mean, can you say more about that? What do you mean that crushed the society? What do you mean by the society that you grew up in?
Well, the things we've been talking about, the culture, whatever, I'm not sure how to explain. I mean, we've been talking about it for however many long we've been talking about it.
Yeah, I guess I meant specifically, what was the Cleveland that you grew up in?
What was it? Well, it was a unique place. I mean, first of all, you know who Ken Tucker is? Ken Tucker, the critic?
No, I don't.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, he's from the 70s, like Greil Marcus. You should look into him someday. Well, anyway, he once said that the two greatest rock and roll bands in America have come out of Cleveland, Ohio, and they're both led by the same person. And he was referring to Rocket and Pere. Cleveland was a place that was a joke to everybody. Everybody laughs at Cleveland. And we in Cleveland loved the city so much. And we didn't pay any attention because our reaction was, good. You keep thinking it's a joke. Don't come here. Leave it to us. We love this. And it was for up until the late 60s, Cleveland had its own daily Hungarian language newspaper. It was a vastly sophisticated, Eastern Europe connection, Lithuanians and Hungarian, tons of Hungarians, tons of Polish. It had art, art, by which I mean good art. The Cleveland Symphony, or George Zell and the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, on and on and on. It had background. It had, you could still see there was still a wall on the near west side where it said, where you could still make out the original painting of, which was elect Elliot Ness mayor, because Elliot Ness ran for Cleveland is where Elliot Ness's family was hidden away during the untouchable years. Cleveland is where he moved to and became I guess they called it safety director or something. And eventually he ran for mayor. And his career was brought down by one of the first mass murder serial killers in America, which would happen, who was terrorizing the city at the, early 40s. I can't remember. And there's a football team. Cleveland exists for football. And baseball, and there's just this feeling in the city. Its nickname was not Mistake on the Lake. Its nickname for decades was the Forest City, because the place is overrun by a chain of parks. Cleveland, at the end of the 19th century, was on the way to being bigger than a bigger city than New York City. Euclid Avenue at that time was compared by Mark Twain and bunches of people to the Champs-Élysées or the Unter den Linden in Berlin. Euclid Avenue was called Millionaires Row, where Rockefeller and all these people had mansions that stretched to the lake, miles and miles to the lake. It's like, and so when I was growing up there, it was like living in a city, living in an ancient, in the midst of an ancient ruin of a culture that we could no longer understand, that had left stones of buildings that speak in a language that we could not understand, anymore. It was abandoned. At sunset, people would flee to the suburbs, as they do in America, and the inner city was left to us. We owned the damn downtown area. There was nobody else down there, but we owned it. We traveled around, it was ours. We possessed it at night. And the flats, the steel mills, we owned them. And this is long before anybody was moving downtown, and it's all been urban renewalized now. And there's $1 million apartments where we used to have our $50 a month rental of a rehearsal loft, So I don't know. I mean, I can go on and on, but it's just, it was a magical place to us, and the important thing to understand is that we knew that, what point does one of those ancient cities that end up in ruins, at what point does it die and start to pass away? Well, it doesn't happen overnight. There's this long period where people are living there, living in Babylon or whatever ancient city, Rome or anything, that has magnificent edifices built by a former civilization, with goals and ideals and beliefs, that are gone, that are lost. And the stones will speak to you, but you can't understand what they're saying. In this sense, was very palpable. This is not something I make up and that I recount years later. You could feel it. You could feel it, and the people who feel that feel it very deeply, and it changes their lives. That's what Cleveland is.
That actually seems like a very nice place to end.
Okay.
David, I can't thank you enough for this.
Okay. Well, you take care.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. All right. Bye.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye. Bye, bye, beginnings, goodbye.